We come now to the 16th chapter of Dr. Nash's book that we're using for Intro to Philosophy and Ethics that's entitled Life's Ultimate Questions. And today we get into Ethics 1, the downward path. And so he's going to deal here with relativism in its different forms, subjectivism and emotivism. And then also he's going to deal a little bit with Joseph Fletcher and his situation ethics, and then he'll really get into what he wants to get into, which is utilitarianism. So I want to say, as you approach any kind of complex thought, and as you also approach the usage of language, when you hear somebody put ism on the end of something they're describing, be cautious about that. Be hesitant to embrace any sort of ism. I don't think there's much as in the way of isms that we really want to be associated with. So you need to have a sense of who you are. Ego itself is not a bad thing, as egoism is a problem. So ego, you have to know who you are. Your parents, since the time you were little, wanted you to cultivate habits where you knew how to take care of yourself, where you made sure you were clean, and that your hygiene habits were taken care of. They wanted to make sure that you were somebody who dressed yourself and was able to do for yourself. And in order to do that, you have to have a sense of self. And so ego in and of itself is a necessity. But egoism means that it's all about you, that it's you-centered. So ego versus egoism, there's a problem with the ism, but not with ego itself. Empirical, we want to be empirical. I don't care where you're coming from, religious or non-religious. If you're doing research, you want to know what the facts are. You want to get as much of the information as you possibly can. And so an empirical approach to things is one that looks at the facts. But empiricism says that the only way that we know anything is through stimulation from the external world, is what we take in through our senses. Empiricism is a very reductionist kind of a view as to how we have knowledge, and it doesn't allow for pre-existing categories within the brain or intrinsic or innate knowledge. All people, I think, have a sense of what ought to and ought not to be legal. We have a sense of the natural law, but also we have a sense of positive law. We don't think that positive law, which means law made by humans, is completely arbitrary. Typically, there's a reason why it stands. So to be legal is to want to do the things that are appropriate in our societies as regards codified normativity regarding human behavior. But legalism is a situation where a person, well, I think of Inspector Javert from Les Miserables. He's driven by the law and by the legal points of the law, and he can't see anything but that system. And so legalism in the New Testament is the Judaizers, or it's the super apostles of 2 Corinthians. It's people who want to take and put the Old Testament law on Gentile believers and have them conform to it. And there's a good repudiation of this in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council. And also there's good repudiation of it in Galatians chapter 2 as Paul engages Peter when they are in a Gentile setting and speaks about how the Jews have never been able to keep the law. Why would we put the Gentiles under it? Science, you don't really need for me to say much about science, but scientism, we've seen already, especially when we're dealing with philosophical naturalism, scientism is using science as a totalizing lens. And so it's the only way we look at things is through science, and only science is valid. And this happens. I mean, scientism is an attempt to take everything and subsume it under that one heading. And it doesn't work, by the way. But so scientism, we can see, is an extreme position. You have to be skeptical, especially in today's world where there's constant marketing coming to you from all directions. If you're not skeptical, you're going to be taken advantage of by every scammer and every advertiser out there. But skepticism is to have a jaundiced eye, is to have a really negative approach to everything, and you doubt everything, and that's not a healthy position at all. And so there is such a thing as relativity, and we can speak with validity about your view being relative to this place where you stand. There's reasons why you think the way that you do. But we say relativism, that's a whole nother ball of wax. Relativism is that everything is relative. And so I want to, the idea of relativism often uses relativity as warrant for its existence or warrant for people holding to it. So let's talk about relativity just a little bit. I'm not going to get geeky on you or sciencey on you. I read Einstein's book called Relativity that he wrote for common folk, for regular lay people. And in it he uses an illustration. He says, imagine you're standing on the back of a train. So you see those yellow bars there on the back of this caboose. You're standing on the back of the train and you're going to drop a coin is what's going to happen. But here's just a description from when somebody's talking about how he used this illustration. Einstein didn't literally drop a coin from a train in a real-life experiment, but he did use the concept of a train and a falling coin as a thought experiment to illustrate his theory of relativity, specifically Galilean relativity and the equivalence principle. In this thought experiment, a person on a train drops a coin. According to Newtonian mechanics, the coin would appear to fall straight down to someone on board the train. So imagine you're looking off down towards the tracks on the back of the caboose and you drop the coin. And so it looks like it's going straight down. But an outside observer, who's standing at the side of the train, over the train's going by, would see the coin moving in a curved path because of the train's motion. So the coin is already moving when it's let go, and some of that impetus remains. Inertia has already been overcome with it, and so it drops, and it drops in a curved path. So this demonstrates how different observers in different frames of reference can perceive the same event differently. So again, you're on the back of that train, and you're the observer. You're standing there on where those yellow bars were on the caboose, and you drop the coin, and what happens is, for you, it describes a downward line. It looks like a downward line. It's just falling straight towards the track. But for the person who's looking at you on the train and the coin that you're dropping, as they're standing at the side of the track, the falling silver dollar describes an arc. And so the event can obviously be perceived differently, but that does not mean that both perceptions are accurate. Which perception is accurate? The one that sees a line or the one that sees an arc? I hope you realize it's the one that sees an arc. Only one is an accurate perception of what truly happens. Perceptions are relative to the location of the observer, but reality is reality regardless of where we stand, what we perceive, or what we think. And this is where relativism fails logically. So he's using the term ethical subjectivism. The term most often used for what he calls ethical subjectivism is ethical emotivism, or it's sometimes called the Bouyer theory. This notion boils down to the assertion that moral utterances are merely expressions of approval or disapproval. I'm one of those 10% of the population who, when I taste cilantro, it tastes like soap to me. But 90% of the people whom I know think that cilantro tastes delicious and they like having it in the things that they're eating. And so the idea is that the ethical assertions we might make, murder is wrong, or adultery is morally wrong, or compassion is good, or generosity is a good thing, a good virtue. We're not really saying anything real if we make those assertions. We're just saying boo theft or murder, or boo dishonesty, and we're just saying yay generosity, yay compassion. That's all that we're doing. We're kind of saying like we're comparing it to like not liking or liking cilantro. So Nash says this. He says that this is a position that's untenable because, first of all, it trivializes all positions because it entails that they are all equally true. The only way to be wrong is to make a mistake about your own feelings, and since that's hard to do, every ethical judgment is true. And he says, since debates over abortion get intense at times, I think that pro-choice advocates would eschew ethical subjectivism, which carries the conviction that the moral judgments of pro-life advocates are also always correct. So that's what's the effect of it is if it's all just a matter of our feelings, then nobody is standing in the moral high ground. Secondly, it means that both sides are always right. If all moral actions are good and bad at the same time, the reason is that people who think they're involved in a moral disagreement are only describing their own subjective states. Nash writes, he says, if Jones says capital punishment is wrong and Smith says capital punishment is good, there's no real disagreement. Jones is saying nothing more than boo capitalism. I'm saying that. He's saying I dislike it. While Smith is saying nothing more than yay capital punishment. The fact that ethical subjectivism entails that both people in a moral dispute are right ought to disqualify the position from serious consideration. The next point is no one really disagrees. So he compares this to eye color. I say if I have brown eyes, and Mr. Smith over next to me says, no, I have blue eyes. But what we're really doing is we're asserting things from our own standpoint, but we're not really disagreeing with one another. We're just saying what is the case for us. And then the next thing he points out is no one means the same thing in their ethical judgments, which that's really problematic. So if we have two different White House advisors who are both saying telling the truth is bad, which is bizarre that they would say that in the first place, but if we do have them saying that, they're saying it for different reasons, so they're not really saying the same thing. They're just expressing their own feelings. And then it turns all moral judgments into either tautologies or contradictions. So a tautology is something that is just the two statements that you're making actually say the same thing, and you know what a contradiction is. So he says, consider a person who says, I like to get drunk, but I know it's wrong. If ethical subjectivism is true, this turns out to be a contradiction. It means I like to get drunk, but I don't like to get drunk. Or if we take the person who says, I like to do what is right, on a subjectivist terms, that reduces to the vacuous claim that I like to do what I like to do. And so what we're doing when we point these things out is we're reducing things down to the point of absurdity. He also points out that those who are proponents of ethical relativism say that all of our ethical views are learned. We learned them from somebody. So there's nothing objective there. We didn't discover them, we learned them. Well, you also learned the times tables, but you don't doubt that they exist because you learned them. You don't doubt that they're real because you learned them. Ethical views are the result of the evolution of our instincts or social feelings. That means the personal evolution, the development of the individual, and also of the race across time. And therefore, again, they're just an epiphenomenon. They're nothing real, and so we oughtn't to pay attention to them. But it's a wrong perspective. It's a perspective that's very easily pulled apart, just as easily it is, we point out about that we learn about the times tables. There, you can learn things that have some validity to them. You can learn things that have some reality, some isness to them. Then he gets into the paradoxical implications of ethical relativism. So ethical relativism is broader than what he has called ethical subjectivism. And in it, he takes in a little bit more ground than just pure relativism. He covers also a bit of cultural relativism when he says this. Excuse me. So he says, what the meaning of this is, if ethical relativism is true, is that no moral code can be better than another one, since everything's relative to different individuals in different societies. That doesn't really need a whole lot of explanation. It's just saying that's different strokes for different folks, meaning individuals or populations or countries. There can be no such thing as moral progress. The reason there can't be any such a thing as moral progress, either for individuals or social groups, is because we're saying whatever we do in our particular area, that's right for us, even though it may be wrong for you. So it would mean that the end of the slavery in the United States was not a sign of moral advancement. And it couldn't be possible for a human being to become a better person because everything's okay already. If we accept ethical relativism, thirdly, moral effort becomes meaningless. Why strive to be better if progress is impossible? And then no human being is better than any other one. And that is just a totally untenable position. We certainly think that there's a difference between an MS-13 gang member and a person who, like Mother Teresa, gives their life caring for the poor and the dying in Calcutta, India. We think that different lives have different worth and value, and one is morally superior to the other. And then there can be no moral reformers, because what I'm actually doing is something that's wrong if I'm bringing about change in a society, since that society is already a good society. It's already, they're keeping to their own rules. It rules out the possibility of a society being a corrupt society. J.P. Moreland argues this. He quotes Moreland, "If relativism is true, then it's impossible in principle to have a true moral reformer who changes a society's code and does not bring out what was already implicit in that code. For moral reformers, by definition, change a society's code by arguing that it is right if and only if it is in the society's code. So the reformer is by definition immoral, since he adopts a set of values outside of the society's code and attempts to change that code in keeping with these values. It's odd to say the least for someone to hold that every moral reformer who ever lived, Moses, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, was immoral by definition. Any moral view which implies this is surely false," says J.P. Moreland. Lastly, he points out that it means that all moral choices are equally good. If all choices are equally good, even tolerance toward other beliefs can be morally correct. Why then should anybody practice tolerance? I can be intolerant, or I meant to say intolerance. Even intolerance towards another's beliefs can be the right way for me to behave. And it is this kind of thinking that is being used to go after, and instead of engage in discussion or argument now in the United States over things that we disagree with, instead I go after you and I try to target you, I try to harm you, I try to, vandalize your property, I physically attack you in public. This is what is happening now in the public square when we're dealing with this kind of a relativistic thought process. Might makes right, because we're not going to engage in conversations and try to arrive at what is actually true. So it's disturbing that the things that are being discussed here are things we're actually seeing playing out on the public stage in American society these days. But what Nash is doing in pointing these things out, the ironies, the paradoxes of this, is he's using the form of argumentation of reductio ad absurdum. That you point out, you take the argument to its ultimate conclusion and show how ridiculous it is. And this is, if there was anybody who was a master of this, it was Francis Schaeffer. His idea was climb on board the other fellow's argument and ride it with him into the wall. Show him the despair in his system. And so it's an interesting way for you, if you wish to engage in debate with somebody, which is hard to even have a true debate anymore, or a dialogue, because people start playing the victim pretty quickly. But if you want to be able to engage successfully in debate, that you would think through your opponent's position and think through the absurd implications of their position. Okay, so Dr. Nash hasn't engaged specifically cultural relativism, but this is something that's important to me because it's something, as we're dealing more and more with globalization and the world is becoming a smaller and smaller place, we're being told that the values of other cultures are valid for those folks and that we have no business judging them. And so Steven Pinker, who I've mentioned to you already before, especially in the context of his work at MIT, but also I think his book, The Blank Slate, it's kind of question mark, blank slate. He's arguing that there is such a thing as human nature, even though some people are saying that there isn't. He's lamenting, although he's not a believer by any means, he's lamenting the same sort of thing I've spoken to you about concerning my students. He says several scholars, this is at Husson University, have noticed that their students are unequipped to explain why Nazism was wrong, because the students feel it's impermissible to criticize the values of another culture. And I've literally had students say to me, well, it would be wrong for us, but it wasn't wrong for them. And it shows you really the loss of the ability to think. So what are some of the logical problems of cultural relativism? The idea that when we see abhorrent practices in other cultures, those are not wrong for them, and we have no business putting our values on another culture. At least some moral issues are not relative to persons or to cultures, but they're universally right or universally wrong. Murder, betrayal of friends and family, cowardice in battle, oath breaking, as long as the oath is not an immoral oath you were forced to take, racial hatred and cruelty, abuse of children. I think that most people, even some of the most adamant relativists, would agree, well, no, I want these things as exceptions. So some moral issues are not relative to persons or cultures. So unless you're making a psychological statement about how someone perceives their own actions, when you say that things like, for instance, female genital mutilation or clitoridectomy or honor killings, when you say that those are okay in other societies, even though they're not okay in our own, you're entering into a place where you're using language in a very strange way, and we ought to question your mental state, your intellectual capabilities. You're entering into a fairly indefensible position if you try to refute this idea that there are real rights and wrongs. Your terms are becoming unclear. What do right and wrong mean if we say they're terms that are relative to persons or cultures? Imagine I tried to play that same game with things having to do with health. So we know that certain practices make for physical health and certain practices militate against our physical well-being. So by way of analogy, imagine instead of making moral prescriptions that we ought to do this or not do that, I'm speaking of physical health, and I tell you that physical well-being, is healthy for most people, but for others, it's what they feel on the inside. Sickness or disease are healthy. So what will you conclude about my thought process? And this is not some hypothetical thing. This is going on right now. Many conditions, a number of conditions, which were previously categorized under the DSM manual as forms of psychoses and mental unhealthiness, are now being put forward that we ought to embrace them and we ought to indulge the psychoses being expressed by others and legitimize it. And so this is a thing that is not theoretical. This is something that's in our face right now. Okay. So there are, I'll bring some of these things to the fore. Child brides in many Arab countries and in some East African countries, there is a practice of having child brides and also there's that young ladies are taken captive well, I would call it never-ending war if we're talking about child warriors and what's going on in southern Sudan and that area. But young ladies are captured and they're 10, 11, 12 years old, and they marry them to some of them have not gone through puberty yet, and they marry them to some older man, oftentimes in his 40s or even early 50s. And so child brides, there's a horrible thing I haven't gotten into in these slides that goes on in Singapore where parents sell their little daughters who are prepubertal into prostitution at those ages. There's honor killings. So in a number of Arab countries, the view is that the woman, the wife, the daughter, the girls in the family, their bodies, which are able to give birth, their uterus, almost you could say, is a receptacle that holds the family's honor. And if a woman is raped, or even if she has consensual sex with somebody else, she's brought dishonor to the family, and now it's incumbent upon us to kill her. I'm her brother, and she's now pregnant because she was raped, and so it's incumbent upon me to kill my sister because she has brought dishonor to the family, or her existence brings dishonor to the family. This is an ongoing, raging battle as the interaction goes on between the Middle East and the Western world, as we see more and more people coming from those cultures into the Western world. Then there's, oftentimes related in the same cultures, female genital mutilation or clitoridectomy. They call it female circumcision, but it's not circumcision. When a male is circumcised, we're not removing his penis, we're just removing the foreskin from the penis. But clitoridectomy is the complete removal of the clitoris. And so there's that. There's sati or sati. It's almost not non-existent anymore. It was practiced in India and in Pakistan, and when England was in those countries, they outlawed the practice, and it hasn't come back, or hasn't come back much at all. But it was the practice of throwing, oftentimes these girls were married off to their husbands when they're very young, taking a much younger woman married to an older man. When he dies, we throw his bride alive onto the funeral pyre so that she can pass through the flames to be his bride in the next world. So we're literally talking about burning someone alive for the sake of her dead husband. This was a practice that went on until it was outlawed. Sicilian rape for purposes of forced marriage. For over 300 years, it has not been an uncommon thing in Sicily. It has recently become now something that's being adjudicated in the courts, and there's much less of it than there has been. But in previous centuries, it was a common thing that Sicilian men who were turned down by a young woman for marriage would hide, and then they would assault her and rape her for purposes of forced marriage. Now that she's been raped, she's damaged goods, and so nobody else will want you, and so you need to marry me. You have to beat me. And wife beating. There's all kinds of legitimation in East Africa and many Arab countries of wife beating. So see, these are some of the practices which American liberals, I know this sounds impossible to believe, and academics defend in other cultures as being right for them, even though they're wrong for us. And ironically, now we have female genital mutilation being performed on young women in America in certain population groups in the USA. And so this is from ABC. This was a documentary from ABC, Underground in America, Female Genital Mutilation. And you can go online and look and find this. It's still available. And this is Sarah, an American survivor who had this done to her. There's no easy solution. If there was, it wouldn't be continuing right now, and it would have ended a long time ago. And so all of the numbers, as this is being studied, that there's over 500,000 American women who are in danger of this kind of mutilation of their healthy body. And so it's just hard to wrap your head around this. Meanwhile, we have people like Whoopi Goldberg. I literally heard Whoopi Goldberg say, I think that it's judgmental of other cultures that we should call this mutilation. We should call this female genital modification. It's comparable to like plastic surgery, for an aesthetic purpose, so that we would look a little bit different. So she's minimizing it because she says that it's something cultural. That's the thing. If something is said to be cultural, it seems to be then it's unassailable. This is Donald Simons. Donald Simons he's died last year actually. He's an American anthropologist, and this is a personal letter that he wrote to Steven Pinker. Pinker includes this in his book, The Blank Slate, but he's talking about how this odd idea has come about that we think if something is cultural, therefore it cannot be critiqued. Excuse me, I had to wet my whistle. So Simons writes, he says, if only one person in the world held down a terrified, struggling, screaming little girl, cut off her genitals with a septic blade. Oftentimes there is not what we would call appropriate cleanliness used or sterilization, and sewed her back up, leaving only a tiny hole for urine and menstrual flow. The only question would be how severely that person should be punished, and whether the death penalty would be a sufficiently severe sanction. But when millions of people do this, instead of the enormity being magnified millions-fold, suddenly it becomes culture, and thereby magically becomes less rather than more horrible, and is even defended by some Western moral thinkers, including feminists. And so it's hard for one to understand why it is that people have lost the ability to think these things through. Why we don't realize that's evil, that's wrong in every culture. We're taking a healthy body, mutilating it, and typically in these situations there's chronic vaginal pain for the rest of the woman's life. One of the things that's a thought process here is they call this the pleasure button. And they say if a woman has too much pleasure in intercourse, then she's going to become, this is the legitimation of it, she's going to become promiscuous. And so by removing that, we help her to be more faithful. It's horrendous. And so this is another atheist. Donald Simons is professedly an atheist, as is Steven Pinker. This is Kai Nielsen, famous atheist, his book Ethics Without God. And he's saying, as an atheist, he's saying, I think these people have lost their ability to think, who are supporting these kinds of things and just saying it's a different culture. He says it is more reasonable to believe such elemental things as wife beating and child abuse to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock. This is just basic reality, and we ought to get that. It's bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral beliefs. So, in the Enlightenment, there is this move from moral codes, such as the Ten Commandments, but there's more than just the Ten Commandments. There's numerous other moral codes, from moral codes to moral theories. And moral theories are human beings trying to solve how it is that we ought to go about being moral folks, being ethically good in our own eyes. Of course, the Bible speaks this way about everyone doing what is good in his own eyes. But in the Enlightenment, the emphasis is on the human intellect, and so not surprisingly, one of the first ways that we would go about trying to do this would be to use math, to have it be that we would quantify something, and this would tell us what was right and wrong. And so we'll get into that, especially as far as utilitarianism is concerned. But we're losing the idea of moral codes, that you actually would teach children things as being specifically right and wrong, which, biblically speaking, the law still has a use. The law still tells us about what God considers to be loving, about what God considers to be normative. And so if we try to step away from the moral codes that we find in Scripture, then we're kind of out on a limb. Joseph Fletcher was an Episcopalian clergyman, a priest, who was also an academic, and he put forward his idea of how we ought to go about being moral in this time, and it's famously called situation ethics. And so he looks at the opposite poles of things ethically. Antinomianism, it's a term that refers to things that we see spoken of in the Bible, to be lawless. To be antinomian is to not consider yourself to be subject to any law. Moral objectivism is the idea that there is real moral, ethical rights and wrongs. And he thinks both positions are incorrect. And so what he postulates is a middle position that he calls situation ethics. This is him saying that. That's not me saying that. That's how he put it. That situation ethics is a middle position, and it's using the biblical idea of the brotherhood of all human beings, the loving brotherhood of all human beings, in order to identify what ethics is. So there is famously a liberal theologian of the 19th century who says that the Bible taught the universal brotherhood of man and the universal fatherhood of God. It does not teach that, but he takes and he picks up on that and he runs with it. And so he says that in every situation, if we do what is the loving thing, that then we will do what is morally right. Well, there's a way in which we could say that that's true. Augustine, when we were dealing with Augustine, he said, love God and do as you please. But he didn't mean just you're on your own, make it up as you go. To love God meant to love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And it meant then that you would have your thinking be conformed to the Word of God. That therefore Romans 12:2, do not let the world press you into its mold, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so situation ethics is not doing that. Situation ethics is just saying to everybody out there, in every situation, do the loving thing and then you'll do the right thing. So undefined love is a little bit too squishy. And what winds up by the way, being the case, is that he abandons Christianity and he becomes an atheist towards the end of his life. He sort of has to go in that direction to be consistent with the things he's been propagating in the world of philosophy and the world of ethics. So Nash then gets into utilitarianism, which is the best known form of consequentialism. We've seen that word before. That word was used by Elizabeth Anscombe to describe utilitarianism. It was a pejorative term when she used it. It meant to say that you're doing ethics simply on the basis of outcomes and not on the basis of motives and not on the basis of moral duty. And so this is not really ethical theory that you've got going on here. This is just saying, that the ends essentially can go in the direction of Machiavellian thought, and it's very pragmatic. The ends justifies the means, potentially. So Ecclesiastes says in chapter 1, verse 9, Kohelet writes, he says, that which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done, so there's nothing new under the sun. Now that passage is not speaking about things like technology, but it's speaking about human nature and human thought. And so it ought not to surprise us that things from the ancient world repeat in our world. We've already seen this as far as the skepticism that came about as a consequence of the work of the pre-Socratics and then the rise of sophism, that there came this point in time where there was great skepticism about truth in the world of Socrates. Now that has happened again and again across time. It happened during the time that gave rise to René Descartes and his idea of I think, therefore I am. And it has happened again as we see the rising up of deconstructionism, postmodern thought. And so that human beings only have just so many options open to them as far as the way they would think. And so it's not a surprise that one of the moral theories that gets put forth is really a repackaging of an ancient way of thinking called hedonism. Hedon is simply the Greek word for pleasure. Hedonism is a system that makes it all about pleasure. There's two types of ancient hedonism, Cyrenaic and Epicurean. And so the Cyrenaic is Aristippus. He is kind of a party animal. That's the guy on the right with a big foofy beard. And he was all about, having a really good time to the point of insanity. This is, we're talking about, like vomitoriums, that men would wear an amulet around their neck. They're partying and drinking, and there's orgiastic behavior going on, and they're eating lots of food. And then what they do is they'd step out of the building they were in and go out to the vomitorium and take this amulet, triangular shaped, and put it down their throat, stimulate their gag reflex, throw up, blow their nose, drink some water, get everything cleaned out, go back in and start partying again. And so that's the kind of stuff he did. And it was like just crazy. It's like the mentality of a college sophomore in a frat house, as far as sophomore guys who oftentimes go completely, bonkers as far as partying goes for a part of their undergraduate education. And so that's Aristippus's philosophy, and pleasure is what determines it all. Now Epicurus comes along, and he has some different thoughts. He thinks that Aristippus is on to something, but he also thinks you're an idiot if you are going to incur 30 units of pleasure that's going to later on cause you 60 units of pain. So there's these two varieties, Cyrenaic and Epicurean, and so it should be said that Aristippus, who represents the Cyrenaic form of thought, he's in the century in which we find Socrates. He's in the 400s, the 5th century before Christ. And then Epicurus is in the 300s, and so he's a contemporary of Aristotle, and so that's the 4th century before Christ. So 5th and 4th century before Christ, these guys are going. And there's these two different forms. So the early Cyrenaic school of Aristippus was concerned with bodily pleasure as the end or telos towards which all human moral behavior ought to move. And it was attractive. It drew a lot of people. Let's have a big party. The Cyrenaics weren't concerned with the future. In fact, they tended to refuse to speculate about the future. They were simply concerned to get all the bodily pleasure they could in the here and now. And so, although Epicurus agrees with the hedonistic principle that the pleasure of each individual is the highest good, he offered a criticism of the crude, sensual hedonism of the Cyrenaics. He contrasted the pleasures of the body, which tend to be more intense, so sexual and food and drink, those sorts of things, but they're more intense but fleeting. When they're over, with the pleasures of the mind, which are often less intense but more lasting. And he thought that one ought to balance these things in one's life. He's not, by the way, against sexual pleasures or the pleasures of food and drink. He's just saying a well-rounded life balances the pleasures. So Dr. Nash uses his illustration. I'll use this one. He's using Thanksgiving dinner versus, I forget what the other thing is he sets it against. I'll say this. I did some of my schooling in England, and I did a lot of research at the University of Oxford, took some classes there. I do not have a degree from Oxford at all. But I did have the opportunity. I've never got to go to high table dinner at Oxford. I would have loved to have done that. I've seen it portrayed and read about it in many different places, and it's supposed to be just incredible. But I did get to have a set lunch at the Quad on High Street in Oxford with a top-level intellectual. And it was amazing. It was just one of the most incredible meals that I've ever had in my life. And so that was very, very enjoyable at that time. I have warm memories of that time. But I can't tell you what I ate. Because you can't bring back sensual pleasures the way you can bring back pleasures that are pleasures of the mind. Now, you may think this is low class. I don't know what you think it is. As far as my taste, I do like some more complex music than this, but my wife and I really enjoy Celtic Woman. We like Celtic music. I like the Ilian pipes and kind of all things Gaelic. But we got to go and see Celtic Woman. It has a lot of dancing. It has a lot of singing, beautiful, beautiful singing, and it has the Celtic music. And so we got to go to the waterfront in Bangor a number of years ago now, maybe 2013, and to see Celtic Woman. And I cannot right now, it's 10 years later since I had set lunch at the Quad restaurant, I can't recall what it was I had, even though I know it was good. But I can remember, I can bring to mind in my mind's eye the dancing, this little woman fiddling and being just incredible, dancing as she's fiddling like a a wild thing, and it being just unbelievably beautiful and drumming and all this stuff going on. And I'm now in my late 60s. When my wife and I are sitting in our rocking chairs, if I should live so long, and we're in our 80s, I'll be able to look over and say, "Hey, remember that time that we went to see Celtic Woman up in Bangor?" And she can look at me and say, "Yeah, that was amazing, wasn't it?" Because the ability of the mind to bring back the pleasures of the mind, whether they're a great vista like the Grand Canyon, or some beautiful crashing surf along a coast, or a mountaintop view, or I've had the pleasure of being in the National Galleries in London and seeing a Monet exhibit, seeing his pictures are a lot taller than you would think. They go from floor to ceiling, some of these beautiful watercolors. And if you get up close to them, you can't tell what they are until you back away. I've had the pleasure of those kinds of things, and I can bring them back to mind. Those are, as Epicurus pointed out, more lasting. So, Epicurus reasoned that if pleasure was the greatest good, then pain was the greatest evil. If an experience would provide a momentary or fleeting bodily pleasure, but in the long run yielded more pain than pleasure, then one was a fool to engage in it. And so that's really what's going on when you're doing the Aristippus kind of thing, when you're doing the frat house sophomore kind of thing. It is, I'm having 30 units of pleasure on Saturday night, but on Sunday morning I've got 50 units of pain because of my hangover, my cotton mouth, my dry heaves, all of that's come to me because of having partied so hard. And so this is Sedley evaluating this kind of thing. If one could quantify pain and pleasure, any pleasurable activity which ultimately caused more pain than the pleasure it produced was simply not worth experiencing. So Epicurus, we would say, is a more refined hedonist. So now this is Jeremy Bentham, and we're dealing. He's in the 17th century. He's born in, and he's alive into the He's born in the 18th century, and he's alive into the 19th century. And he is the big proponent of utilitarianism. That picture, by the way, on the right, are his skeletal mummified remains, not the face. The face is made out of wax. I don't know if they got Madame Tussaud to do that or who did that, but it is at New College, London, and he endowed the college in such a way that his remains are to be brought out and placed at board meetings from time to time. I don't know if they actually comply with his wishes any longer, but it became a big thing at the school to try to steal the head. That's a story for another day. I'll let you look those things up. But he's a genius. This man was an absolutely brilliant man. So this is his time frame, and he's born in London, and he was a child prodigy. He started reading when he was a toddler, and he studied Latin at age 3. Of course, it means you have proactive parents that want to help you. He studied law at Queen's College, Oxford. That's a top-level college at the best university in the world. He earned his bachelor's at 15 and his master's at 18. So we're talking about a genius-level guy. And he had interest especially in mathematics. He does a lot of work in math. He also had interest in criminology and penology. This is a famous, whenever you see this word put forth, panopticon, there have been science fiction movies and things made about this. It's his idea. It's the idea of a prison where you only would need to have like 2 guards. So all of those windows represent cells around the prison that he envisioned, and there's a tower in the middle that can see into all the cells. And so 2 guards can take care of this great big jail. And so he thought there needed to be reform, and it was an area that he thought that the way that the law and the punishment of criminal behaviors was done in his time was wrong. He was a very, very forward-thinking, liberal kind of a guy. He was for women being able to vote. He was for women's rights. He was for toleration of gay and lesbian behaviors. All of that stuff is way ahead of his time. But he's also thinking in all different directions. So I don't want to give you a straw man of Jeremy Bentham. He's brilliant, and he's very interesting. I mean, he's one of these guys you have to read about, so it tells you the fellows who are, or the men and women who have this kind of an impact on history are folks who are extraordinary as far as their capabilities mentally, usually. So this is him. He says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think, Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. So that's his famous book about this, and it's a big tome. I own the book. So Bentham believed that ethics could be done by the scientific method, so empirical observation and then mathematical measurement. And so he wants to measure pain. How long, how strong, how certain, how soon is it that I'm going to have, not pain, pleasure. How long will the pleasure be? And well, we'll get into this. He calls it the hedonic calculus. So he's on to something. Happiness can be measured since you can have more of it or less of it. Pleasure can be measured since you can have more of it or less of it. Right? There's things that gave you one you've gone back to in order to have them again and have as much pleasure as you had from it before, and you find that it doesn't give you quite as much pleasure as it did before. That's called the law of diminishing returns. We can address that in another time or in one of our discussions. But this is it's quantifiable anyway. So the archery motif, I just remind you, is something I use in my secular classes to speak about the aiming and shooting, looking to try to hit the goal, the mark, the bullseye of the good, the right, or the ought in terms of morality. So utilitarianism, kind of giving you in a nutshell, an action is right insofar as it tends to produce the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Okay, that's the primary thing to understand out of the starting gate. And its way of figuring this out is called the hedonic calculus. That's the terminology that was coined by Bentham. And so here are his categories. Intensity. How strong is the pleasure or pain? How long will the pleasure or pain last? How likely or unlikely is it that the pleasure or pain will occur? How soon will the pleasure or pain occur? The probability that the action will be followed by sensations of the same kind, and the probability that it will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind, and then how many people will be affected. So some of these words are familiar to you: intensity and duration, certainty or uncertainty. You're not used to the word propinquity, and fecundity is not a common word, but you can see their meaning right there. So I like to just put it in terms of how long, how strong, how certain, how soon, what's the likelihood of more, what's the likelihood of no more, and how many people get to enjoy this pleasure. Okay, so just how strong, how long, how certain, how soon, likelihood of more, likelihood of no more, how many experience it. Okay, so going on, the third point, it's especially a political concept needing democratic government for one to trust in its usefulness. Okay, and it's in our country, it's primarily used in the fields of medicine and in the military. It makes sense. I mean, in medicine, there's limited resources, excuse me, to go around. Let's think in terms of like organ transplants. And so those limited resources have to go where they would do the most good. Okay, we make our decision not on that somebody's just in line, but who are this set of lungs going to help, or who are these kidneys going to help more? The guy who has been a chain smoker for all of his life, and now he needs a lung transplant when he's in his late 50s, or a young mother who's in her 30s, and she's never been a smoker and she takes care of her body. We're going to make a decision in terms of, those kinds of reckoning. So it needs, in whether it's in that realm, in the realm of medicine, or if it's in the realm of the military, how many soldiers is going to cost me? How many lives will it cost to conquer this particular objective? And you can think of it back in, if I put it in the Korean theater of battle, when we were in Korea, there were certain hills. They marked these hills, and it was how many lives did it cost to take this particular hill. And so that one is doing that kind of calculus oftentimes in warfare. And so those are places where it seems to have a legitimate use, that we're looking for the greatest good for the greatest number. We do think that there's something to the idea that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, that there's something to that. And then the consequences of an action determine its rightness or wrongness, not the motives from which it was done. So I, in utilitarian terms, could do something where I meant to hurt you, but it winds up helping you. That makes my act morally a good act, even though my intentions were bad. So that's a problem. But the consequences of an action make it right or wrong, not the motives from which it's done. So Bentham said acts are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, which means pleasure by that, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, which is pain and lack of pleasure. So this is from Blaise Pascal, from his Pensées, and I'm We're going to take the word happiness and change its meaning now. So we're going to get into John Stuart Mill, who is a student of Bentham's, and in a way we could call him his philosophical grandson. But he's going to take the term happiness and imbue it with more meaning than it had under Bentham, much the way that Epicurus takes pleasure and changes the meaning of pleasure to round it out more fully than what it meant under Aristippus and the Cyrenaic hedonists. So Pascal says all men seek happiness, and it is one of these things. There's very few ultimate reasons why we run, why we live, what that we're after. A lot of the things we do, like why do I have a job so I can make money, and why do I want to make money so I can provide for my family, and all. You start thinking there's always more things as to the reason why. But ultimately, we only want certain things. We want a sense of meaning or purpose. We want happiness. We want love. There's very few ultimate ends where I don't want happiness so I could have something else. I don't want love so I could have something else. I want them just for them. So it's one of those ultimate things. So whatever different means people employ, they all tend to this end. They want to be happy at the end of the day. The cause of some going to war and others avoiding it is the same desire in both, attended with different views. This is the motive of every action of every man, even of those who hang themselves. They think I'll be happier if I'm dead, if I don't have to deal with life. And so happiness is one of those very few ultimate ends. And John Stuart Mill is more representative of happiness than he is of pleasure. You'll see what I mean here. So this is particularly unflattering pictures. I can't find a nice picture of John Stuart Mill. Apparently he was just kind of a homely guy, or he did not have a very good groomsman. I don't know what to say. But he was brilliant, like Bentham. And this is his years, so he's in the 19th century. And he's born in London. And he's the son of James Mill, who is a philosopher, economist, and East India Company official, and who is really a disciple of Jeremy Bentham. And so he's educated by his dad and Jeremy Bentham. So that's interesting. He's kind of being homeschooled by two brilliant men. He learns Greek at age 3. And he grows up and he gets an education. We get into his schooling. But the point ultimately is that he suffered a nervous breakdown at 20. He suffered a nervous breakdown at age 20. And it's because his life was very austere. It was very empty of things that gave it meaning. He was in a kind of a mathematical world with this, pain and pleasure kind of calculus going on as far as ethics is concerned, but everything was very scientific and mathematical. And he credits the poetry of Wordsworth with helping him to recover his sanity and to make him want to live again. And so he starts to discover aesthetic pleasure. He says that he has a conversion, but it's not a religious conversion. It's a conversion to a more robust and full way of living. He, in many ways, sounds like Epicurus as far as wanting to have pleasures that are more than just the sensual pleasures. And so during his time, when he's a young man, a well-known Christian speaker, philosopher, I believe clergyman, Thomas Carlyle, I ought to check on that, makes a statement about Bentham that Bentham's philosophy is a pig's philosophy, And so he means that, it just seems like this is a very degrading way of evaluating the worth of a human life. Mill understood him to be saying that Bentham's sort of utilitarians claim that life has no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit. And he took that to mean that in the eyes of people who think like Carlyle does, that such a philosophy is utterly mean and groveling. It's a doctrine worthy only of swine, a way of thinking that belongs to pigs. And so he doesn't like that. He doesn't want to have part of the population thinking that he thinks that way. So he understood the brilliance of Bentham, and I imagine he had some affection towards him, but he also recognized his limitations and failings. In response to Carlyle's critique of Bentham, Mill famously said, "Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better be wise than to be just enjoying pleasure." He believed he could do better than Bentham, and he ultimately set about to write his own utilitarian theory. And so he says that cultural, intellectual, and spiritual pleasures are of greater value than mere physical pleasure, because the former would be valued more highly by competent judges than the latter. A competent judge, according to Mill, is anyone who's experienced both the lower pleasures and the higher ones. He's not saying that good food and sexual pleasures and the pleasures of drink and that sort of thing, that they're useless. But he's saying that ultimately they're not as valuable as the pleasures of the mind. He's an advocate of what's called rule utilitarianism. Dr. Nash just touches upon that there is such a thing as rule versus act utilitarianism. But the idea is you obey those rules which experience has shown will produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So he's not, both of these men are very forward thinking, as I said already, and they're for things that were not part of their society at that time. But they're for women's rights and for LGBT rights, and they're both people who would like to see changes in the way that prisons were run and so on. They think alike in those ways. But he's not somebody who wants to change everything the way that Bentham does. Bentham was willing to upend government and make all kinds of changes idealistically. But what Mills thinks is we should put the brakes on, and we should keep things in place as they are, and then slowly make changes. And so there's rules out there, and we don't change those rules until we know we've got better rules. When you always know what people will do, you get predictability and security. So he's for those kinds of things. So just a reminder that with utilitarianism, it's the greatest good for the greatest number. This is a way to be able to remember its reasoning process. So this is Dr. Nash, and he's showing you what this means ultimately. Imagine two worlds. In one world, leaders of a nation seize the property of a minority of citizens and send them to concentration camps where many are tortured and killed. Let us suppose that the suffering of these people produces significantly more pleasure for the majority in that society than would have happened without the theft of property, the persecution and imprisonment, and the killing of innocent people. This is what took place beginning on Kristallnacht and then afterwards in the former Third Reich, what had been the Weimar Republic. And this was done to the Jews, and much of their wealth and much of the beautiful things that they had, paintings and so on, were just taken away from them, holding land and all of that. In World II, the citizens of the country treat all citizens justly, but for some reason the amount of pleasure or happiness in World II falls short of that produced in World I. The hedonistic utilitarian would have to say that on his grounds, World I is ethically superior to World II, better a world where there was the final solution than one where there wasn't, which is horrific. Okay. Dr. Nash differentiates between the hedonistic utilitarianism of Bentham and Mills, as I said to you, Mills isn't quite so hedonistic, and the ideal utilitarianism of, he doesn't bring up Sidgwick, but Sidgwick is in the middle part of the 19th century. G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell are at the end of the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And it's a different form of utilitarianism. But nonetheless, utilitarianism and deontology reigns supreme until 1955, when Elizabeth Anscombe puts forward her appeal for using Aristotelian thought as far as the approach to ethics, and then that world changed and it was turned upside down. But this is utilitarianism, and I'll just contrast the two. So Bentham, greatest good, meaning pleasure for the greatest number. Mill, greatest happiness for the greatest number. And happiness is a term that he's given it more meaning, more content. He's getting close to what Aristotelian eudaimonism, but he's not gone quite that far. But that's what he wants. He wants it to be a word that has a whole lot of meaning than just the pleasure that was under Bentham. For Bentham, it's focused primarily on the individual. For Mill, he's concerned with the individual and with the common good. For Bentham, it's quantitative. It's the hedonic calculus, how long, how strong, how certain, how soon, so on. For Mill, it's qualitative, higher versus lower pleasures, and balancing those things in your life. Bentham is act utilitarianism, and he wants to modify society and make things as they should be. He's a social engineer. Mill, it's rule utilitarianism, put the brakes on. Let's not change anything until we're sure we're going to make a big difference. But both of them espouse consequentialist reasoning. The outcomes are what makes an act good. So these are some critiques of utilitarianism. It's too simplistic. It deals only in happiness and quantities thereof. It neglects matters such as justice, goodness, and the rights of individuals. Second bullet point, it's entirely subjective. Consequently, it omits the idea of true versus false or superficial versus deep happiness. And that's got some weight to it. The third point, it seeks to avoid metaphysics, ultimate reality, and to be purely scientific, but it has a built-in metaphysics, which is materialism. We decide everything on the basis of the physical world. It's naturalistic or philosophically naturalistic. Utilitarianism has a natural tendency towards playing God and creating social engineers. Bentham wanted to be a social engineer, and he was involved in politics for those purposes. And the desire to give the greatest good to the greatest number of people has been a driving motivation of numerous social engineers across time. Just hit the pause button for a second and say to you, if talking about this kind of thing is interesting to you, if you've never read C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, especially some people call it the Space trilogy, the third book of that trilogy, That Hideous Strength, especially addresses this kind of thing. And interestingly, of course, these things are always packaged in nice terms, and so there's this group called the NICE. And NICE, N-I-C-E, stands for National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, as people are engineering what the society is to be. Okay, going on with critique of utilitarianism. It cannot tell us why we should act unselfishly. It presents a calculus, but it gives no true values. So Bertrand Russell, the most famous atheist of the first half of the 20th century, was G.E. Moore's compadre in the heading up of the philosophy department at Cambridge. He was also a mathematician at Cambridge, but he worked together with him, and Wittgenstein was their student. And Russell was a utilitarian, and his girls loved their dad. But both of his girls talk about how dad was completely useless when it came to trying to teach us right and wrong. Mom could teach us right and wrong, but dad's approach to right and wrong was just a ridiculous way to try to educate little children. We weren't taught any moral values by dad. Next, utilitarianism has no classification for evil. What is evil is now what produces the most pain for the largest number of people, and what is good is what produces the most pleasure. And so I put down here, witness the Chinese process of execution for the purpose of harvesting human organs. And so this is something that Amnesty International and a lot of different bodies have addressed. It's been well documented. It has been taken out of public soccer arenas and that sort of thing where it was being done and is now being hidden, but it still appears to be going on because China still is the primary country to go to in the world if you need to have an organ transplant and you have enough money to have it done. And it is that Falun Gong practitioners, which Falun Gong is an interesting kind of religion. It has some what would I say, exercise or almost similar in some ways to yoga kind of practices associated with a spirituality. And it's kind of a mystery as to why China hates the Falun Gong practitioners so much and wants to kill them, but they have executed thousands and thousands of them and harvested their organs and sold them. And so the idea is greatest good for the greatest number of people. We get rid of these people who we consider to be a problem in our society, and we make money on their death and selling their organs and helping other people with their organs. It gives no, next critique, it gives no wide-angle lens explanation for the value of a life apart from the pleasure one experienced and that one helped to bring about for others. So if we're looking back on somebody's life, well, he or she helped bring a lot of pleasure, and they had a lot of pleasure. That's what made a good life or a bad life. It seems a bit simplistic. Is pleasure all that we want, really? I mean, think about a mom. Most moms. Just think about maternal instincts. How much do women sacrifice things that give them pleasure in order to take care of their children? It's just part of motherhood. And I know an awful lot of public school teachers and love them. And these are folks who are they're not knocking down big salaries. And they take their money from the little pittance that they earn and go out and buy things for kids because they care about kids. So they sacrifice for their kids. Now, does that make them happy doing that? Yes, because they want the children to have a certain kind of experience. But pleasure isn't all that we want, right? We want to see certain things based on principle, on what we think others ought to be able to have, whether they're our children or whether they're people that we care for in the way that some teachers care for students. It seems to be universally rejected by those whom we hold to be moral examples. There's no moral hero of the 19th, 20th, or 21st century who's a moral hero because they were a utilitarian, right? And it's a reduction of ethics to facts. It's missing a dimension that we feel necessarily belongs to ethics. You can't do ethics just on the basis of how long, how strong, and so on. And so I just want to mention as we end she's not a Christian, Ursula Le Guin, not to my knowledge, but she's written a little book, a little story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelis, and I put it in files for you to be able to look at it. It's only 4 pages long, but it's sort of a little parable about utilitarian thinking. And if you have the time to be able to engage it, I'd encourage you to read it. Because it is speaking about this idea that the suffering, in this case of one, is legitimized since it makes for the happiness of the many. Okay, we'll end there.